Welcome everybody to Texas Sea Grant's webinar titled Knauss to NOAA, How the Knauss Fellowship Can Jumpstart Your NOAA Career, with Dr. Nicolás Alvarado presenting his story about how his travels from graduate school to NOAA through the Knauss Fellowship impacted his life and his career. Before I introduce Nick to you formally, I do want to tell you that we have muted everybody who is joining the webinar today to cut down on background noise. We do, however, want to answer any questions you might have today to ask Nick, and so we ask you to put those questions into the chat box. There should be a chat box at the bottom of your screen, and if you open that up, you could type in your questions, and I will ask those questions at the end of the webinar. Thank you for joining us, and I'm pleased now to introduce to you Dr. Nicolás Alvarado. He started his NOAA career as a Knauss Marine Policy Fellow in the year 2004. Where he assisted the NOAA Science Advisory Board during that fellowship year. After his Knauss Fellowship, Dr. Alvarado worked as a physical scientist for 9 years, supporting NOAA research in the Office of Ocean Exploration and Research. Dr. Alvarado then worked as a fishery management specialist and an Endangered Species Act consultant biologist for 8 years, supporting NOAA fisheries. After 17 years at NOAA, Dr. Alvarado joined the National Ocean Service and became one of 10 NOAA Regional Navigation Managers in 2021. Dr. Alvarado earned his PhD from Texas A&M University in the Department of Oceanography. And the only thing I have to add there is whoop. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Alvarado. It is a pleasure to have you connect with us today to talk about your pathway from Knauss to NOAA. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Plotkin, and thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure, or it's a pleasure for me to be here and have the opportunity to share my experience with you. So Knauss to NOAA, how the Knauss Fellowship can jumpstart your career. So this is my journey. Every fellow has their own experiences, which might vary slightly. The presentation is an informal setting. It'll take about 35 to 40 minutes. So we should have plenty of time if you want to ask questions, but I can't see the monitor. So Hunter or Dr. Plotkin, if you want to let me know when a question comes in and ask it, or unmute the lines, we can freestyle it on that front. So feel free to ask. We should have plenty of time. If for whatever reason we start running low on time, we'll just keep going through the presentation if we're running behind, and then we'll just leave some time at the end. So the starting point is graduate school. I had my PhD, as Dr. Plotkin said, with Peter Sanchi, which some of you might have taken classes with him, if not, or will be taking classes with him. If you do see him, tell him I say hi. And I wanted to touch on the international students. If there are any international students listening in, if you could either raise your hand and let Hunter know. It's not for immigration purposes, it's just an additional hoop that you will have to go through for the Knauss Fellowship, and I'll touch on that as well. With the Knauss Fellowship, what is it? And again, the international component of the optional practical training, the OPT, and then what the opportunities from the fellowship that occur or that present themselves. So here's a little background of my NOAA journey, where I joined OAR first, Oceanic and Atmospheric Research Line Office, and I'll have a little plot of what that means. And under OAR, there was the Office of Ocean Exploration. There's the National Marine Fisheries Service. And these are the three branches or three experiences that I had: Protected Resources, the Southeast Regional Office, and the Sustainable Fisheries, HMS. And then finally, the National Ocean Service. And then after that, why NOAA, why the Knauss Fellowship, and the history behind the Texas Sea Grant candidates. So that's a nice treat. As I was preparing for this presentation, I discovered some stuff which I'll share with you at the end. So my career path was The reason why I mentioned the international aspect was I'm Canadian. I did my undergrad in chemistry and my master's in groundwater geochemistry at the University of Ottawa, the capital of Canada. And then I had the opportunity to do my PhD research in biogeoradiochemistry, organic matter, specifically with the interactions with trace metals or thorium-234, which Peter is a world-renowned researcher in that field. And so he took me in, and I finished my PhD in 2004, and I did my fellowship that following year with the NOAA Science Advisory Board, Ocean Exploration, Protected Resources, Sustainable Fisheries, and then Coast Survey. And then just as a timeline, in 2013, that's when I became a US citizen. And then 3 years later, I became a Fed, hence the flag and the NOAA logo in that slide. So as I mentioned, NOAA has line offices, and that's basically the divisions under NOAA, under the NOAA umbrella. So you have NESDIS, the National Environmental Satellite Data Information Service, NIMS, National Marine Fisheries Service, NOS, National Ocean Service, the National Weather Service, which is very popular on its own, and then the Office of Marine Aviation and Operations, which also houses the NOAA Corps. And if you didn't know this, NOAA Corps is also a military service, but it focuses primarily on surveying and doing research. And then last but not least is the Office of Oceanic and Atmospheric Research. So as you can tell, there's these 6 line offices under the NOAA umbrella, and depending on what your area of interest, you have a lot of opportunities to find what you like and what you're looking for in NOAA. And the only other federal agency that has a similar portfolio would be NASA. So, I mean, there's a lot of, that would be the only other agency that could compete with NOAA on that front with regards to the diversity. So the Knauss Fellowship, there's the link to the program. If you haven't visited that link yet, I highly recommend it. Hunter, can you see by a show of hands on the on your screen if there are any international students listening in right now? And if you're an international student.
Excuse me. So far, I haven't seen any international people comment or raise their hands.
Okay. So if you do show your hand later, that's fine. We can go back to this. But just one of the things that there's the optional practical training. That's just an added logistical aspect in the application process that will allow you to participate in the Knauss Fellowship. So that's just something additional for the international students. The other aspect of being an international student is that some of the hosts or offices, you're just not eligible for security clearances. And that I found out the hard way, because my strategy was to get into the offices with the highest leaders. Basically, I wanted to work for the NOAA administrator, and right off the bat, I couldn't because of that aspect. And then my backup was working for the Office of the Oceanographer of the Navy. But again, that required security clearance, so I was automatically ineligible for that. One of the things, if you do get selected for the Knauss Fellowship, it is a competitive environment. The year that I applied for, I think there were 5 or 6 other candidates, and I was the only one that was selected and presented at the national level. So not only do you have to compete within your state to be chosen as the Texas Sea Grant Fellow, once you get past that first hurdle, you then have to compete at the national level, where you're competing against every other state that has a Sea Grant Fellow submitted. And then it's pretty competitive. So if you don't get in the first year, don't be discouraged. Strengthen your application and then apply the following year. I think it'll be worth it. But if you get in the first year, congratulations. So once you get in, and once you get past that national level competition, you basically have executive offices and legislative offices competing for you as a fellow. Fellows, Knauss Fellows have a very strong reputation for being go-getters. They get things done. And so the one thing that I would highly recommend once you get to that level is to think outside the box. Me coming in from a strong science background working for Peter Sanchi, I had the predisposition of leaning towards the National Science Foundation hosts. And because I knew I could hit the ground running, I wouldn't have to ramp up to very much because my funding came from NSF when I was a PhD student. And so it would just seem like a natural fit. But at the time, the Knauss Sea Grant director and staff were like, think outside the box, don't go there. Think of what would be the total opposite end of the spectrum. So at the end of the day, we're all, curious. And so the Office of Ocean Exploration sort of seemed to be a natural direction to go to, just because I'd never do anything like that for my career. But, let's try it. And then the other one was the NOAA Science Advisory Board. So at the end of the day, I was debating which of these two positions, as opposed to the National Science Foundation, I should go to. And I opted to go with this NOAA Science Advisory Board. And the reason being is I couldn't work for the NOAA administrator as a fellow, but if I worked for the NOAA Science Advisory Board, I could interact with him 3 times out of the year. The benefit of that, and we'll go to the next slide, is the NOAA Science Advisory Board. It advises NOAA on the necessary input to ensure all the science programs of the highest quality. So you have a board that consists of scientists, engineers, resource managers, educators at the highest level in the scientific community as your executive or as your board. So you're interacting with these people who are well established, and then you are helping the executive director, who is the liaison. The SAB is the liaison between the board itself, NOAA, big NOAA in the executive level. So we're talking about the NOAA administrator, and then all the NOAA assistant administrators. So that's all the directors of the 6 line offices that I mentioned to you. So you're rubbing elbows with senior leadership. And so that's why I opted to go with the NOAA Science Advisory Board. So as I mentioned, there were 3 meetings, annual meetings that NOAA administrator met with the board. And in those lulls, I had some time for myself. And so one of the things that I did was I kept my eye on ocean exploration, the program. And that year, they didn't get a fellow. The previous year, they were beating fellows away because they had to turn them down. They had like 3 or 4 Knauss Fellows for that one office, but the following year, the big goose egg. So I took advantage of that. And what I did was, with approval of Mike Uhart, the executive director of the SAB at the time, I asked him if I could, approach them to see if I could get to help them out. And he said, absolutely. So what I ended up doing is I got 2 Knauss experiences in 1 year. I was able to work with ocean exploration in between my meetings with the Science Advisory Board. So I really took advantage of that. And I got to go to an expedition to the Gulf of Alaska looking at seamounts and deep sea corals. And I was at sea for 28 days. And I realized after that experience that 26 days is my limit on a ship. And the cool thing about the pedigree that the Knauss Fellowship gives you, after my first meeting with the Science Advisory Board, Dr. Jake Rice was a member. He was the international component for the board, and he was a chief scientist for the Canadian Department of Fisheries and Oceans. When he found out I was Canadian, he actually told me, he offered me a job on the spot. Quit now and I'll take you, and you can be my liaison for Fisheries and Ocean for Canada. So I was very flattered, but I'm like, this is my first meeting. I can't just quit the fellowship. So that's the kind of pedigree that the Knauss Fellowship is, just as an FYI. So like I mentioned, there's the 6 line offices. I started my SAB experience in OAR. That's where it's housed. And the Office of Ocean Exploration is housed in the same line office. So by working with them during my fellowship year, I was able to get my foot in the door. And that was my first job after the fellowship, working with ocean exploration and research. And I was the grants manager for 8-9 years. I processed over 80 projects, and they totaled of over $44 million in federal awards. And there's the 3 different categories within ocean exploration and research. Ocean exploration, marine archaeology, and education and outreach. And OE is known for its web presence. Any project that they decide to fund, they invest, this is on the program side, ocean exploration, federal dollars, they invest on a web presence for the project that they decide to fund. So if it's multidisciplinary, if it's got a lot of videos and imagery opportunities, they will put a web coordinator on board, and they basically create an online near real-time journal of the expedition, and they have the researchers do highlighted activities that they're experiencing. I did get a chance to do some national and international travel. Because of my background, and some of you may know Dr. Tom Iliff down in Galveston, and if you've done the science program, the scientific diving program, you might have been introduced to some technical aspects of diving. But I took my diving with Tom, and back then, back in the office with OE, I was the only one who actually had any diving experience, any technical diving experience. So like I mentioned about the web presence for the signature expeditions, I used that to leverage me getting involved with projects and traveling to Guam and Palau and becoming the paparazzi for the researchers. I videotaped them in action, going down to 300-foot dives, doing rebreather dives, going into caves and whatnot. And then also on the marine archaeology side of the house, we went to the Gulf of Mexico and the Florida, I can't remember the area now, shoot. But anyhow, it's on the website. If you search Early Man and Gulf of Mexico, you'll see Andy Hemmings and Jim Adavasio's projects that we funded. And we went down and looked for artifacts or presence of early man in the Gulf of Mexico. And back then, the water levels were about 100 feet lower, so that's why they were targeting that area. One of the benefits of working with ocean exploration, I chaired national conferences, AGU, ASLA, Ocean Sciences, I think for 8 years in a row, where we had an OE session. So you get the chance to network with academia. All the people that we funded, they were invited to present their findings at these sessions. So, we'll go into why Knauss, but this is an opportunity to either postpone your academic future, or it's an alternative path, and we'll go into that in a minute. But so you do get to network within academia at these conferences and continuous communications with the grantees. And within NOAA, because you're working in partnership with different line offices to leverage assets that you might have or may not have, and you're relying on other NOAA programs. And there's also a lot of different detail opportunities, but one that I was offered 3 times, but because I was a contractor, I had to turn them down, was the Program Coordination Office detail, or the PCO detail. And that's basically, you are the liaison for OAR or NIMS or NESDIS downtown in the Department of Commerce in the Hoover building. So you are residing in that DC area, in the DC building, and you are basically providing the Undersecretary of Commerce, in this case, it's Miss Gina Raimundo. And you are the liaison between the line office administrator and the Undersecretary of Oceans and Science and the NOAA administrator. So then I went from OAR to National Marine Fisheries Service. Sorry, I need to just get a sip of water here. Are there any questions yet, Hunter?
Yes, so we have 2 questions so far.
Okay. Should I go ahead and pause and try and answer them now? Or should we wait?
I would say let's wait till the end, and then we'll pose
Okay.
all questions then.
Okay. So we moved to NIMS, and I worked in the Office of Protected Resources, and that deals with the Endangered Species Act. And I was a consulting biologist, and we basically look at threatened and endangered sea turtles, Gulf sturgeon, marine mammals, and their critical habitat in the Gulf of Mexico specifically. So as a consultation biologist, I tracked and monitored 77 Deepwater Horizon oil spill consultations, and that's formal and informal. And if you ever ask yourself, well, will I make a difference as a Knauss Fellow? The answer is yes. Will you make an impact working for NOAA? I think the safe answer is yes. And I thought $44 million was huge when I worked for ocean exploration, but after analyzing my the work I did as a contractor with PRD, I was shocked and amazed, and it made me feel proud of working for NOAA that my hands touched projects that were over $500 million worth in restoration funds. So that, I was like, can you really make a difference not being in academia and trying something else? Yes, you can. So the kinds of projects that crossed my digital desktop were artificial reef installations or restorations of boat ramps and fishing piers. But if there are any divers amongst us in our digital forum here, I was responsible for approving the sinking of the Kraken 67 miles south of Galveston in 135 feet of water. So that was kind of cool where I was involved. I can say I helped the Great Texas Barrier Reef Program. Another program that I was involved with, which again, these are opportunities that you don't realize you have until you look back in your career. And this oceanic fish restoration program, while I was with PRD, is one of those moments where I worked with the people in highly migratory species because they were the ones championing for this program. And this program was essentially subsidizing commercial fishermen in the Gulf of Mexico not to fish between January and June of every year for a total of 5 years. And that was in an effort to give bluefin tuna the opportunity to not be stressed by fishing these fish out of the environment. So it gives them a chance to grow and then have those cohorts move along in their life cycle. So as a result of that consultation, that got my foot in the door for the next stage in my life, but we'll keep going about with regards to protected resources. This isn't typical of protected resources. This interaction with various stakeholders is typical for all offices in NOAA. This is not just protected resources. So just to let you know, I worked with NOAA Restoration Center for all of these projects because they were also shepherding these projects along. You work with the Gulf of Mexico state scientists, who were also recipients of the awards from the Restore monies as a result of the oil spill. You work with NGOs, and the big one here that I worked with was the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. And I received some awards as a result of that work. After protected resources, when you do good work, people notice. And so they actually created a position in the Southeast Regional Office in the Directorate because there were 3 people that needed assistance, but they couldn't justify hiring someone. But if they pooled their efforts together, then there was a position that was created, and I got that role, but it was a short-lived role because immediately after this gig, I was offered the position with highly migratory species and became a Fed. But the reason why I got this position was in the previous one, the 77 consultations, I was able to juggle everything in a timely manner. I met all my deadlines, and everything was funded in time. And so if you can imagine, you've got 77 projects, 90 days to consult formal and informal consultations, and able to do this on time, that's when they're like, we need Nick here. So that's why I worked for the Directorate and helping the senior advisor to the regional administrator. I helped the NEPA coordinator, and I helped the Gulf of Mexico Ecosystem Restoration Compliance Coordinator. And I got awards for that as well. So when you do good work, people notice and they will search you out. So as I mentioned, the Oceanic Fish Restoration Program was the stepping stone to me becoming a Fed. HMS, as it's dearly referred to, is in charge of tunas, sharks, swordfish, and billfish in the Atlantic Ocean, Gulf of Mexico, and the Caribbean waters. And HMS are basically fish that travel long distance and cross boundaries, domestic and international. So one of the big feathers in my cap is I authored and led a rulemaking which amended the increase of swordfish and shark fishing in the Caribbean. In the 5 years that I was with HMS, I'm proud to say that I was involved with that, where it gave the stakeholders, the constituency, increased opportunity to fish because swordfish fishery was not overfished and overfishing was not occurring. So it was an opportunity to better the lives of the commercial fishermen and the artisanal fishermen in the Caribbean. I also assisted in 4 other management amendments. And as a result of my experience with protected resources and the skill set of having statistics under my belt, sort of made me stand out, because when unfortunately the gentleman who took care of the monitoring the commercial recreational fisheries for the pelagic longline fishery, he passed away. And there was a quarterly deadline of making these calculations. So when volunteers were requested within the division, no one stood up, and at that point I'm like, okay, this is an opportunity for me to shine. So I went ahead and threw my name in the hat, and since there was no other one else, they had to choose me. But I got the job done, and then I was the go-to person for Endangered Species Act compliance for fisheries. And then I also got a chance to work with NIMF's Fisheries Law Enforcement Office. So this slide is just to show the products that the Fisheries Office does. So here's the highly migratory species, and you've got the different sharks here, which are being fished or overfished, or they're not, depending on what species is showing up here. And so HMS dealt with all of this area here. So it was quite impressive that when you realized, the magnitude and the impact that you have on making sure that you get work done in a timely manner that affects the constituency. We do make an impact in NOAA. Not that you have to be convinced of that, because if you are looking at the Knauss Fellowship, you already know that. Okay, so oops, what happened here? Oh, okay, that's why it's, okay, there we go. So I went from NIMFS to the National Ocean Service, which is where I reside now. And I work in the Office of Coast Survey. So who is Coast Survey? Well, actually, Coast Survey came before NOAA. It was the first agency in the US, formed in 1807. And it's responsible for surveying 3.4 million square nautical miles, and it prepares and maintains thousands of nautical charts. And the part that I am involved with is it responds to disasters and other emergencies, and develops hydrodynamic models and supports coastal management. So here's a little map, I say, of the scope of coverage. So it's all the continuous and the US and the islands and territories. And we've got 95,000 miles of coastline and 25,000 miles of navigable channels. So in the Office of Coast Survey, we've got a lot of tools in our portfolio. For example, we've got satellite data, satellite communication. We've got aerial LiDAR, aerial imagery, and airborne gravimeters. We've got air gap sensors under the bridges. We've got ports, visibility sensors, and ports stands for Physical Oceanography Real-Time System. And that allows us to have information at our fingertips in near real time or real time in order to make decisions on whether cargoes have the clearance under the keel and the air gap coverage under certain bridges, or if you have to wait for low tide for them to come in, or in the reverse, if you have to need the high tide in order to have the under keel clearance. We've got continuous operating reference stations, water level gauges, water quality monitors. We've got buoys with sensors for ocean chemistry, wave heights, water temperatures, meteorological sensors, harmful algal blooms. We've got aids to navigation. That's what ATON stands for. Mounted acoustic Doppler current profilers. So that gives you the currents. And these slides, you'll have access to them. And if I'm not mistaken, I do provide you with some web pages where you can actually see real-time currents in the Nowcast, and I'll show you that in a minute if we have time. And then we also have gliders or autonomous underwater vehicles, in addition to the single beam and multi-beam sonar vessels, the big white ships. So at the end of the day, within OCS, we want to have coastal intelligence, which provides timely, actionable information developed from reliable, authoritative science to provide insight into present and future conditions of coastal zones. So this is just NOS. You can easily find a slide for fisheries, for OAR, oceanic and atmospheric research, that encompasses, all this complexity. So as a Nav Manager, just checking time here, I work in the Office of Coast Survey, and I help identify navigational challenges in the maritime transportation system. And I provide resources and services that promote safe and efficient navigation. So the primary role that I have is I'm the liaison between NOAA, the US Coast Guard, and the Army Corps of Engineers. So if a storm event takes place, and in my region, that's usually a hurricane, and it hits the port of Tampa, port of Miami, Key West, or San Juan in Puerto Rico, my job is to coordinate assets. And when I say assets, I'm talking about survey vessels like this one down here to survey the ports and channels as soon as possible and identify if there are any aids or dangers to navigation for the incoming vessels. And if there are, I notify the Coast Guard or the Army Corps of Engineers, and they come in right away and dredge to open that channel up and allow commerce transit to come in and out of the port. So my primary objective is to reopen the ports as soon as possible and protect lives. So this slide up here is the hurricane tracks from 1995 to present day. So as you can tell, I guess this is where the spaghetti models verbiage came from, because it looks like a big plate of spaghetti, and the Gulf of Mexico is the big bowl, and you can see all the different noodles of the track lines. So you can see that the Gulf of Mexico is pretty busy, and the northern Gulf of Mexico is guaranteed to get hit by a storm. So I'm pretty fortunate, looking at the big storms. Florida doesn't look like it gets hit very often compared to the center of the Gulf of Mexico. So this link here, I'm not going to click on it, but it's there, it's available. And when you get your hands on this PowerPoint, you can go ahead and play with it. And it'll send you to the Nowcast, where you can see all sorts of good stuff. And in this picture here, down here on the bottom right corner, we've got an unmanned survey vehicle. So this is basically a remotely operated or an autonomously operated, where you preset the track lines and it'll basically survey the bottom. So you don't actually have to have someone on board. And in case there's like really dangerous conditions, you can send these vehicles out. And this past season, one of the autonomous sail drones actually went through the center of, I don't think it was Ida, I think it was the one after Ida, and I can't remember, you have to forgive me. But that made the CNN news. So why NOAA, why Knauss? Well, how did I get into my career in NOAA? Ironically enough, it was a fellow graduate student and former Knauss Fellow, Beth Lumsden, who was the fellow in 2003. And she came back to pay us a visit and say hi and check in on us, and told us all about it. And she said, she approached me and said, Nick, you should look at this, because I think you would be awesome. You would thrive in this environment. And I was like, I don't know. I had my heart set on academia. I think I'm okay. And then, after some more thinking, I'm like, well, let's give it a go. So I tried it. I got in. And the Knauss Fellowship is a good opportunity to see what's out there. If you're not sure what you want to do, give it a go. The worst thing that could happen is they could say, yes, you experience the Knauss Fellowship. And if you're like me, you never look back. After that, I never wanted to go back to academia. And ironically enough, I had former professors apply for funding when I was with ocean exploration. And some got funding, some didn't. But, you know, it changed my life for the better, I think. And I was able to make a difference. But so think of it as an opportunity to either postpone your studies, because some fellows did go back to academia and were stronger scientists for it because they understood the policy and the decisions behind policy, the making of policy that helped them improve their research writing skills to apply for grants. So food for thought. And then when I was done my fellowship, I did the same thing that Beth did for me. I told Dwight and I said, Dwight, you should look at this. I think you have the type of personality and know how that you would thrive in this. And ironically enough, well, actually not, I'm not surprised. Dwight is the deputy director for the NOAA Ocean Acidification Program. And I'm sure it's just a matter of time before he becomes the director once the current director retires. So where can Knauss take you? The question I would pose would be more like, where can't the Knauss program take you? Because you can go as far as you want to go. And for example, Letice, a Knauss member of 06, is now a NOAA senior advisor. Dr. Ponwith, Bonnie, she was a fellow in 98, and the star for these fellows indicates that they were from the Texas Sea Grant program. Before she retired, she was the NOAA Fisheries, Southeast Fisheries Science Director. Andy Oliver is a friend of mine up in the DC area, and she was a fellow in 96 and was a professional staffer. She stayed on the legislative side of the House. Our very own Dr. Plotkin was a fellow in 94, and now she's the Texas Sea Grant Director. Russ was the former NOS Assistant Administrator, so that's the highest level of senior leadership in the individual line offices. The only step up from there would be the NOAA Administrator, but he was from the Texas Sea Grant office, and he was a fellow in 92, and he was the NOS Assistant Administrator, and is now the current Washington Sea Grant Director. And Steve Olson, class of 87, is the American Zoological Association Senior Vice President in Government Affairs. He's still in the DC area, and if you do get selected and you participate in the Knauss Fellowship, I highly recommend you go to the AZA networking opportunities, because they usually bring critters. And the gentleman, Jack, he was on the Letterman show. He took care of, he introduced David to some weird and unique animals. He usually attends those meetings as well. So this is just sort of a snapshot of the pedigree of what the Knauss membership is, what it does, and the people that have been there before you, and what it can offer you. So what are the benefits from working with NOAA? In this day and age, with this new normal, with the pandemic environment, NOAA has been instrumental in giving its employees and contractors the flexibility to work from home. I don't know if any other private industry would be able to give its employees the same opportunities. But for example, as soon as we were on what they call evacuation orders, where we can work from home, they gave the NOAA employees, the feds, 2 hours per day to help take care of your family members, whether they were your children or an elderly family member. 2 hours per day. So that's working an 8-hour day. And then within those 8 hours, you were given 2 hours of that flexible time to take care of your family. That was a game changer, because I have 2 kids at home, and when we had to teach them e-learning, because we didn't want them to go to school in case of risking exposure for the COVID environment or COVID virus in the early stages when we didn't know very much, that was just a breath of fresh air and just a lot of flexibility. So That's one aspect on a personal level. On a professional level, you've got 6 different companies under the umbrella of NOAA. So whether you're a data scientist where you can kind of work in all of them, or whether you're a biologist and you only want to work in fisheries, or if you're a statistical person and you want to work in research, NOAA, and like I said, the only other federal agency that competes with the spectrum of a portfolio would be NASA. And they've got the coolness factor with the air and space and, you know, being space cadets. And I jest, but no, I mean, no, NASA's would be the only other agency that would compete against them. So like I said, NOAA does everything. This slide encompasses pretty much everything that's under the sun, including satellites. And what NOAA does, we've got the white vessels, the hurricane hunters that go into the storms. We've got scuba divers, we've got endangered species, science, service, and stewardship. NOAA is a pretty darn cool place to work in. And if it wasn't for the Knauss Fellowship, I probably wouldn't have experienced it. So the takeaways, if you haven't started looking at your application, start early, reach out to the previous year's fellow, talk to your local Sea Grant office if you haven't already done so. For the international students, you've got the optional practical training that you have to worry about. And again, I was an F1 student visa student, but I know that that's not the only student visa that exists. So it might be different for the different visa student holders. And then there's my email address. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. If there's enough interest for another more casual session like this, where it's more of a, you know, open forum and I can answer questions specifically. And, you know, what will your journey look like? This was mine. And I think on that note, I'm more than happy to answer any questions. So let me go back to here and I'll stop sharing my share.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Dr.
Nick.
Alvarado. I'm going to ask you a number of questions that have come in our chat box and question and answer box. You ready?
Okay.
Okay.
Yep.
So the first question from Ashley, is there an advantage to having a PhD before applying for Knauss?
Yes. Yes, yes, yes. And the reason why I say that is, so don't tell this to Peter, and if he's on this line, let me know. Peter actually told me to turn down the fellowship, and the timing was interesting because he was on sabbatical when I applied. So I was waiting to get some good results to sugarcoat the news. And when I told him, he's like, turn it down. I was like, no, I'm not turning it down. So, but to answer the question, yes, please, I would highly recommend finishing your PhD before you start the Knauss Fellowship. And the reason being is, if you don't finish beforehand, you're going to spend every waking moment trying to finish your PhD on your weekends or in the evenings to get it done, right? But those are the moments where you have networking opportunities in your fellowship. So fortunately for me, I actually started my fellowship a month late with Mike Uhart's permission, my host, because Peter said, okay, I'll let you go, but if you have to finish before you start. And I said, no problem. And Mike said, yes. And as a result of that, I was able to enjoy the fellowship to the fullest. And the people in my fellowship class that didn't do that, they were spending every weekend working on it. And they were basically doing 2 jobs at once in one moment. The fellowship, which is a full-time gig, and depending on your office, you could be doing some travel on a regular basis. And then you have to do your PhD or your master's and write up or finish whatever you need to do. So I would highly recommend. I mean, you can do it. It can be done. Friends of mine during my fellowship year did it. They were exhausted by the time they finished, but they did it. But you would be doing yourself a favor by finishing your PhD first, and then that way you can enjoy the fellowship for all it has to offer. Now, granted, 2021 was a really challenging year for our fellows because everything was remote, and that really took a huge hit for the Knauss experience. And so I don't know what their hosts offices have done or what they plan to do, but I'm hoping that things go back to normal where you can get in-person activities and networking opportunities back on track. Does that answer the question?
Excellent. Okay, question number 2, also from Ashley. Do you have to be associated with a university to apply, or is it within a certain time frame of graduating?
That is a very good question. My understanding is that you have to be affiliated with a university because you have to go through the Texas, well, in this case, the Texas Sea Grant program. If you approach the Texas Sea Grant and, to apply, they will be able to tell you whether you're eligible or not. So if you're in a current program, wherever you are, if you're not in Texas, reach out to your local Sea Grant office. And if you are past that window, Ashley, are you online right now? Can you use your microphone? Can we unmute Ashley?
I think we're trying.
There we
right
go.
now.
She should be able to speak now.
Hi.
Hi. So how far, so you've already graduated, I take it?
No, I'm graduating in May, but it was to when you were saying about reapplying the next year. That's what I was wondering if it was
Oh, I
possible
see.
to still
I see.
reapply if you're not associated once you've graduated.
So when you're saying you're finished in May, you're talking about graduating in May?
Yes.
I would apply now. Because I mean, if it's just going to your grad, you can start the fellowship in February and then fly down for your graduation. That's what I would do if I were you.
But I couldn't, if I didn't get it this year, I couldn't reapply next year.
Oh, I see. I see. So if you don't get selected, that's a good question. I don't know. Dr. Plotkin, any insight?
Mia has an answer for that. And Mia, can we unmute Mia?
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was a really good question.
This is Mia Zolinsky with Texas Sea Grant, the research coordinator, and I was about to type in my email address for anyone who wants to get additional information, and if you have any questions, but I hit enter too quickly there. But I did have the web page for application information for applying through Texas A&M University Texas Sea Grant. That link has all of the guidance, it has eligibility, it has information related to what you will want to include in your application, when it is due, and how it will actually be reviewed and then ultimately submitted to NOAA this spring. And so there are also additional guidelines that have updated review criteria guidelines that both the state review team and the national review team at NOAA will be looking at your application to see if each of the review criteria elements are addressed in your different documents within your application. And this year, the NOAA National Sea Grant Fellowship Program did a great job at breaking down all of those little review criteria pertaining to all of your application documents and giving recommendations. This is what you ought to maybe consider to include and how to include and how many words and that sort of thing. So we have updated our webpage to provide you all of those resources for your review. There's a prior Knauss Fellowship webinar that was held, I think, in early October, end of September, perhaps. But we've uploaded that webinar as well as their presentation materials. And I also wanted to address that. Know that this fellowship is both a professional and an educational fellowship opportunity. And there will be some students who might be in the process of completing their PhD, might be planning to actually maybe finish up some research work, or going back to your school to actually defend your PhD. So But I think Nick has made valuable guidance, though, that ultimately, if you can already have that degree so that you can focus on those 12 months of your fellowship, that would be the ideal thing. But just know that as this is both a professional and an educational fellowship, and life is the way it is, it is okay to know that you may not have had to have completed your degree yet. And there, in the federal funding opportunity budget guidelines, it actually has approved costs that are earmarked for professional related travel or educational related travel. A few years back, tuition expenses weren't allowed to be used by the award funds, but with good feedback through the years, the fellowship program has determined that even some tuition costs can be considered an acceptable cost to be used by your award funds. So I hope that you visit our webpage. And Hunter helped me tremendously in helping update our webpage and provide the guidance that's needed. It will be very, very helpful to applicants for this year's competition. And Texas Sea Grant will be hosting our own webinar probably about mid-January, and we will include a link to our webpage with the date at that time when we come back from the holidays. But what our goal will be for our webinar is for you to understand, with all of the resources there that are provided by the National Sea Grant Fellowship Program Office and also our resources, to help you package the most competitive application, because as Nick said, it's a very competitive process. And we want to make sure that you are a success and you're considered as the applications that we would want to move forward for a national review. So visit that webpage that's in the chat box, and then email me with any further questions that you may need.
And, you know, I'm available. You've got my email address. So if you have any follow-up questions that you either didn't think of now or, you know, didn't feel comfortable asking in a group setting, no worries. I'm here to help. The fellowship was a wonderful experience. I've never experienced anything like it. You've got, during my fellowship year, it was 42 or 43 offices vying for 36 fellows. It was very competitive, and you have to do your top 5, there you go, top 5 choices. And if you match the office that you're interested in, you're in their top 3, then there's a good chance that you're going to connect. Yeah, I mean, it's a very unique, experience. So when you do make it, let me know how it went. Let's see if it's changed. But from what I understand, they've increased it from like 36 to 66 fellows now, something insane like that. And then just you've got the Coast Guard interested in a fellow, EPA, NSF has always been there. And I think there's been an expansion, and I'm not sure if the State Department gets a fellow now or if they're interested in one, but I wouldn't be surprised if they did. I mean, that's the Knauss is affectionately referred to as the Knauss Mafia in the DC area. I mean, they're everywhere. Dan Ash was the administrator for Fish and Wildlife Service before he retired, and he was a fellow. You know, so they're everywhere.
Nick, may I also add one more comment?
Sure.
I'm trying to remember now on our webpage if we have a link to it. If not, go to Knauss, NOAA Knauss Inside Sea Grant Prospective Fellows, and there's also a link for current fellows, and you can browse the prior host offices, you know, who they were, what their interest is, and then also with the interviews that have been going on for our pending finalists for fellowships beginning February of 22, they should have probably by now listed those current host offices that are in that interviewing process for the 2022 fellows. The executive, there's the executive fellowship and a legislative fellowship. The executive fellows interview, the finalists interview with these host offices during the month of October or so of that
Okay.
to the fellowship beginning. And you're literally, I know one of our fellows had 15 interviews in one day. And so it's pretty intense. The last couple of years, they instead of actually going to Washington, D.C. and interviewing with the host offices, of course, with COVID, they've done these placement week type host office interviews with the finalists via Zoom, and apparently it's been quite successful. And so executive finalists interview in the October timeframe with host offices, and then the legislative finalists interview with their congressional host offices. Amazingly enough, not until January, right before that fellowship starts, February 1. But that's just the nature of working with Congress and budgets and all of that sort of thing. So I did want to interject that if you go to the NOAA Knauss website, you can see a lot of cool information on who these host offices are and what their interests are, and that can help you gear your application towards that.
The only caveat to that is don't rely on those same hosts' offices to be there when you apply or when you interview, because that's what I did. And I was expecting certain hosts to be there, but for whatever reason, they just didn't have the funds or they didn't have the leadership to initiate the Sea Grant Knauss experience. So just take that with a grain of salt, hope for the best. And if they're there, if you're interested in a specific office, and they're there that when you apply, great, but look at your alternatives, keep an open mind, and think outside the box.
Any more questions for Dr. Alvarado?
We have 2 more questions in our question and answer. Maybe we can pose those.
Okay.
Here we go. One is the next 2 are also from Ashley. She reads that I'm from Canada.
You cut out there, Hunter.
Comment.
Okay, I'll go ahead and read it. She writes, I'm from Canada, but also an American citizen, and I didn't realize there was so much crossover between DFO and Sea Grant. Is this common?
It depends on the program. Like I mentioned, when Dr. Rice offered me the job, that was at one of the higher level offices with the Science Advisory Board. And as much as I would have liked to have taken him up on it, because it feels nice being, catered to and sought out and competed for, I didn't want to walk away from the Knauss Fellowship just because I worked so hard to get there. So I told him that after my fellowship, I'll let him know. Depending on the program, for example, if with NOS, with the Office of Coast Survey, we have a Great Lakes Regional Manager. And so he works with Department of Fisheries and Ocean with the water level datums, vertical datums, EPIC program right now, because we're looking at every 20 or 25 years, they redo the vertical datums. And so that's an effort right now with the US and Canada working together for the Great Lakes. But again, that it depends on the program. With fisheries, with my experience with highly migratory species, there was a group within the division that dealt with international fisheries aspects with ICAT. And so obviously DFO in Canada being one of the partners within the ICAT environment, they had to negotiate with the other host countries within ICAT for quota for different HMS. So it depends on what program you're in, the level of overlap with DFO. Not every program has it. For example, ocean exploration didn't have any overlap with fisheries in Canada or fisheries and ocean in Canada. So it depends. Yeah.
Ashley says that's very interesting, and thank you.
You're
so we've
welcome.
got 2 more questions. I'm going to start with another one from Ashley. And this is a great question. She says that she'll be graduating in May, but the fellowship doesn't start until the following February. Are there common jobs or internships that fellows do in that intermittent time period, possibly something to further their knowledge within Sea Grant prior to starting the Knauss Fellowship?
So I'm not seeing that question, am I? No, hold on. Oh, here we go. That's a good question. I don't see. For me, I was racing against the clock, trying to finish my research and then defend. So I'm coming in from the other end of that spectrum. I don't know how to answer that question. I'm just thinking here off the top of my head. Maybe some volunteering opportunities, if that's something that you can afford, because obviously it's tough volunteering your time as a graduate student. But anything that would help you, either improve your application packet so that you can check that box of serving the community, or anything that will strengthen your application. Yeah, I don't know what else I could tell you on that one, just because I'm not familiar with that experience. I can't speak to it. Sorry.
No problem.
May I add something there?
Yes, please.
Sure.
Going back to the application requirements, your career goal, professional goal statement, thinking through that and thinking through your CV and what you've done and what you'd like to do, and why you feel that you as a fellowship applicant, what you can bring to the program, as well as how you feel the Knauss Fellowship, this specific fellowship as opposed to others, could bring to you to help advance your career. So it's a give and take relationship, but in your career goal statement, your CV, and then there's the document where you list your activities for, I think it's the spring, summer, and fall of that year prior to the fellowship, which Ashley, I think that's where you're deriving your question from. Just also think as to why you're wanting to pursue this fellowship and policy, and show how your prior classes you've taken, your future classes, your prior activities, future activities will hone in so that the reviewers are saying, oh, okay, this does make sense. She has done this. She has said that she's done this, and she wants to do this and apply it with marine policy towards your career goals and objectives and your activities for this spring, summer, and fall that you'll want to list. And really consider trying to always go back to the couple of pages in the federal funding opportunity guidelines and in the student guidelines, where they give you the suggestions of what to look for and think about when you're packaging all of your documents. And you may be able to get an idea of looking at all of those guides together, you might be able to formulate a direction as to what you could include as an activity, whether it's volunteering or just simply taking classes, or what you're having to take, even though, so for example, Ashley, you're going to be graduating that May. Try to look out and determine what your background can then move forward with whatever activities you might want to try to depict in your activity statement. And it may not necessarily be Sea Grant volunteer activities or internship type activities specifically with Sea Grant. I mean, other activities that coastal related, or whatever your background is, education wise and personal wise and professional development wise, you'll be able to kind of figure that out and specifically look towards not only stepping into those activities, but also writing those activities down on paper so that the reviewer can see how you're dedicated in that direction. I know that there's a lot of words and that isn't giving you a specific, yes, look for this internship or this volunteer activity, but just wanting you to be aware to kind of think about everything together and how your different documents will show your interest in what you can provide for the fellowship and for the reviewers when they're reviewing their application.
Thanks, Mia. So our last question is from Jordana, and Jordana asks, you said about 5 people from Texas applied, but you were the only candidate selected. Is there a maximum number of applicants the Texas Sea Grant can select for the fellowship? And to follow that up, what do you think made your application really stand out when you applied?
So let me just clarify something. So there were 5 candidates at the state level that I knew had applied for the fellowship. And then I was the only one that was selected within Texas to go to the national level. But from that experience, I know that California, I think, had 3 fellows from their Sea Grant region. And so I think there were as many as 3 from a specific Texas Sea Grant program. But usually it's like 1 or 2 or sometimes none, because I know that sometimes even though a state forwards candidates, it's like I said, it's so competitive and they just don't make the cut, unfortunately. What made mine stand out, to be honest with you, I don't know, but that previous year, something made the soundbite clip where a member of parliament, this is in Canada, was making some case about natural gas and climate warming, and he made some reference to dinosaurs. And so I think I included that of dinosaur flatulence in my essay, and just to sort of stand out, and it just, the way I had incorporated it into my essay, it flowed. It wasn't something that, I just mentioned flatulence, but in the context, it made sense. And the following year, I was selected as the current Knauss member to sit in on the selection panel at the national level. And one of the former fellows, who was Sea Grant director, I think in Michigan, happened to be a reviewer for my selection. And so when he found out that I was in the class of 2004, he's like, "Where were you from?" I was like, "Oh, I'm Nick." And goes, "What did you write your essay on?" And I was just like, I was connecting the dots in my mind. I'm like, well, I did this. And I didn't mention the dinosaur flatulence, but he's like, "Oh, dinosaur farts, you're that guy." So apparently that worked, where I stood out, and I checked his box of, oh, this guy's unique. He brings something different to the table because of the way I wrote my essay. But I think you just have to be honest with yourself. Be true to yourself. If you see weaknesses in your application, I would take advantage of that weakness and say how the Knauss Fellowship can help you fill in that gap. So I mean, that's a good question. Everyone has their own story. I'm sure if you ask, you know, Bruce Vogt from Virginia, what made his stand out, he'll tell you a different answer. I think you just have to be honest with yourself, be true to yourself, and you know, give it the best shot you have.
Great advice. And a great story, Dr. Alvarado. Thank you for sharing it with us and
My pleasure.
taking the time today to connect with some aspiring Knauss Fellows and with the rest of us here from Texas Sea Grant to share stories, share your trajectory, and share the incredible career that you've had with NOAA. And I think the take-home message is NOAA has something for everybody, and that's the Knauss Fellowship is a great pathway to NOAA. So
It's a
thank you
springboard.
for encouraging the next generation.
And if you ever need another session, I'm there for you. Let me know. I'll be more than happy to share my experiences again.
Excellent. Thank you all. And thank you to everybody who joined us today. We look forward to receiving your applications, and we're here to help you develop competitive application packages. So, you know, feel free to reach out to any of us if you have questions. And don't forget that Mia is going to be hosting a webinar in mid-January to help everybody understand how to develop a competitive application package for the Knauss Fellowship. And so stay tuned for more information. We usually post that on our website as well as to our listservs. Thank you, everybody, and take care. And thanks again, Dr. Alvarado.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Bye-bye.
Bye.